Alkan was French, of Jewish ancestry. That was reflected partly in some of his compositions.
Alkan's father was called Alkan Morange. Alkan was born Charles Valentin Morange, but he took his father's name of Alkan. And in fact, he had 5 brothers, and they all called themselves Alkan.
Yes, he had 5 brothers and 1 sister, and they were all prodigiously talented musicians and developed careers of their own within music in Paris. Alkan was the eldest and far and away the most extraordinarily gifted.
At the age of 6, he obviously must have completed his ordinary scholastic studies, and he started at the Paris Conservatoire at the age of 6. And in a way, he graduated at 7½. He got premier prix for something called solfège, a sort of sight singing, which is horrendously difficult, in fact. He then started the piano, got first prize for piano at 11. And Rossini, who was not very easily taken in or influenced, he described him as that wonderful child, and he was looked upon as second Mozart. But by 15, he was considered one of the leading virtuosi in Paris. He moved into the very fashionable Square d'Orléans, where Alexandre Dumas lived, Zimmermann, his former teacher, lived, and was soon joined by Chopin and Georges Sand. In fact, he and Chopin became next-door neighbours, great friends. They used to go to the opera together, they used to go to cabaret together, and of course he became very closely associated with Liszt. And he and Liszt played on the concert platform together. I suppose Liszt was, 26, and Alkan was about 24. There's an extraordinary description of Alkan, Chopin, Zimmermann, and Gutmann, the dedicatee of Chopin's Third Scherzo. They all played Alkan's transcription for 8 hands of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. There's a very sad letter from Chopin about 2 years later. Dear Alkan, I'd love to play the 7th again, but I don't feel strong enough.
Yes, he did seem to fit in remarkably well with his contemporaries. There was a concert in which he took part at a young age with Liszt performing, and also with an even younger César Franck making his debut at the age of 14, I think. And he was, of course, accepted very much as an equal with all of these names, and seemed to be going on to present himself as a virtuoso pianist of some distinction. And even quite early on in his 20s, he made the, what seems in light of his later life, rather daring attempt to break into the international scene by coming to London. He had, in fact, 2 trips to London, and as far as I'm aware, they're the only times that he left Paris.
So he was very, very much in the midst of things. And of course, the French musical fraternity had very, very high hopes. He was their leading pianist, and soon one of their most promising composers.
His early works, as far as I can ascertain, the few of them that I've seen were extremely virtuosic and not terribly substantial, I'm afraid to say. The first significant ones, I believe, are the 2 concerti da camera. Those have considerable charm, I think, and could very well be placed alongside the Hummel concerti, for example, which are performed from time to time. They certainly do not deserve the neglect that they have been subjected to. The first really substantial work, I think, that took him out of his pen, aside from certain sets of studies, was the Sonata, Opus 33, which I believe is from 1846. And I can understand that this particular work, the Sonata, did not appeal too much to pianists, because it contains, among other things, a 9-voice fugato that takes hours and hours and days and weeks of study in order to bring it off.
up to about the age of 24, he seemed to be on the crest of the wave of fame and everything that goes with it. And suddenly, the shutters come down, and he becomes a recluse.
I think that there seems to be almost a persecution mania about the way he viewed certain events in his life. There were two specific times. First of all, the publication of his Grand Sonata, which is by any terms a major landmark in 19th century music. And unfortunately, and one has to say unfortunately in many cases in Alkan's life, the timing wasn't right. And this publication was almost straight away ruined because Paris was then thrown into revolution in 1849. So his grand opus, if you like, was almost totally ignored. The other event, which seems to have been a major thorn in his side, really, was his attempt to be given the job of the head of piano at the Paris Conservatoire, which he felt was his by right.
He was a pupil of Zimmermann. Zimmermann taught everybody under the sun, César Franck. Alkan, of course, he was his favourite pupil, and later on the young Bizet. Zimmermann was the head of the piano faculty in the Conservatoire. And he decided to retire in 1848. And Alkan was the obvious person to get the job.
However, there were three other candidates, all three of which he very apparently considered to be markedly inferior to himself. In fact, the job was eventually given to his pupil, which was really rubbing his nose in it as far as he was concerned. And instead of throwing this aside and maybe saying, well, that's life, it seems to have been an opportunity for him to once again disappear from public view. He seems to have disappeared from Paris life for years at a time. And what was going on during all of that time must have been a re-evaluation of everything that he and his contemporaries were trying to express in musical terms. The early works are pretty much in the same line as many of his contemporaries, rather showy, facile sets of variations and encore pieces. But there are gaps in his performing career during which he must have been beginning to write these more distinctive works, and an altogether different style of musical language becomes apparent almost straight away. It seems like suddenly the artifice of these virtuoso pieces has been taken away, and in its place there is a much more inquiring musical language.
I associate him most closely with Berlioz. But Alkan, curiously enough, did not like Berlioz. He found him to be rather unimaginative. It's interesting to see that the composer Kaykozuru Sorabji also compared him to Berlioz, talking about the sonatine for piano, saying that it sounded like a Beethoven sonata written by Berlioz. To me, there's another name that comes to mind, and that's Schubert. Simply because, like Schubert, Alkan was able to create very tragic moods with an extraordinary economy of means.
Everybody described as a misanthrope. But I think he's somebody who didn't suffer fools gladly. I think he hated anything that was showy or gaudy. He dressed totally in black. He lived very, very privately, did all his own shopping, wouldn't allow anybody else to do it. He was tremendously well read. he studied all the time, indefatigable student of Jewish law. He was a Franco-Jewish family. He translated the whole of the Bible, Old and New Testament, from Syriac into French. He said at one time if he lived long enough, he'd want to set the whole of the Bible to music. He was highly religious. People gave parties for him, towards the end of his life, and he would turn up. And before the main guests had arrived, the clock struck 10. He always left immediately, sort of Cinderella figure. I've often wondered what it would be like to meet him. I'm sure he would have been delightful to somebody he found was congenial, but difficult to get close to because he kept 2 flats. And if somebody happened to get into the lower flat, he simply escaped to the upper flat. And see, people were always sent away by the concierge. He was given instruction that nobody's allowed in, only pupils who have a definite appointment. I think he didn't want to have his rhythm of life interfered with. It was absolutely regulated.
I have a picture of him which is rather severe. I think he was a highly intellectual man, so one has to have this sort of rather austere image of him. And I think that you can hear that in the music. There's a great passion, undoubtedly, near the surface, but over the top of that there's laid a rather severe and cold facade. And the way that he shows this in the music is in a very rigid structure and worked out way of presenting the musical ideas. There was no show about him, but then there's a strange kind of paradox because later on in his life, after all these years of not appearing as a performer or even socially in the Paris musical scene, he chose to come out of retirement and present a series of concerts in Paris.
In his 60th year, he suddenly decided that he wants to make a comeback as a pianist. And he inaugurated what he called 6 petits concerts.
And the programs which he chose to play on those occasions were gigantic and full of, it was an attempt to survey the complete history of piano music from Rameau, who he admired very much, and Couperin, up to his own music. And that, in a way, seems to be more of a statement which is a little outside the general picture of someone who's quite happy to be on his own for vast stretches of his life.
Legend has always had it that he died under a falling bookcase. Isidore Philippe claimed to be one of the people who discovered him. They noticed that the curtains hadn't moved. Alkan had not been seen for a day or 2. They were worried. They broke down the door. They went in, and they found him horizontal with this upturned bookcase. He was trapped and, of course, dead. Now, there is an account by Alexander the Better, Hungarian pianist who met Alkan and with Isidore Philippe was one of the coffin bearers. He gives a totally different account. He said that he was found stretched out and lifeless beside his stove that he was about to light to cook his evening meal, which sounds very normal. He may have had a heart attack or something like this. So there we are. The whole thing is wrapped in mystery. But I think it's essential for the mystique of Alkan that he should have died under the bookcase, but not, as some people say, clutching the Talmud, the Hebrew book. But it is such a strange life and such a strange end. The obituary reads, Alkan has died. But most people say, who was Alkan? The French never really forgave him because he was their greatest hope as a national composer and pianist, and he didn't raise a finger to promote himself. So they allowed him to go into oblivion. Nobody took any notice of him until Isidore Philippe persuaded Busoni, and Busoni was absolutely taken with his music.
And it was Busoni, incidentally, who said that he thought Alkan was one of the very few great post-Beethoven piano composers, and that is including Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, and Brahms. The music has been let go out of print during the first part of the century, and the pianists who have had the courage to dig it up or find old copies or whatever were very rare. But there were people like Petri, Claudio Arrau, believe it or not, who were interested in his music. And in their early days, especially Arrau's, did try to propagate it.
And so it was not really until the era of LP gramophone records that the musical fraternity had any chance of knowing what this music was like. This was around about 69 or 70, so it's not so long ago, 25 years ago.
I think that the Opus 39 set of minor key studies is extraordinary work. Of course, it contains within the 12 pieces the 3 that make up the concerto and 4 movements which make up a symphony for solo piano. And leaving aside those 7 movements, the other 5 are on a gigantic scale.
The Concerto for Solo Piano is probably his largest, certainly one of his greatest piano works. The first movement plays for about 28 minutes, so the first movement alone is as long as the whole of the Liszt sonata. And it goes through at one tempo from beginning to end. It's got colossal impetus. It starts, for the first 2 or 3 minutes, with an orchestral exposition, which of course is played by the pianists, but it's totally orchestral in conception. And there is little doubt to the listener when the solo part enters. Then there's a very expansive piano exposition in which obviously there are effects of piano and orchestra together, which of course the pianist has to get across. Then there's a huge development section. At the heart of this is one of the strangest passages in the whole of 19th century music, in which suddenly everything is stilled and frozen, and you get the rhythm of the opening. Jumpa di ya ba 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 ba, yumpa da dum ba da da, is repeated bar after bar, hypnotically, and wisps of the second subject weave round it.
It's a coming together of several things. The psychology of music is a thread which it's difficult to relate to other composers. There's a bitterness about it and an irony and at times grotesque nature, which, well, Liszt sometimes got into this area, but not many of his contemporaries. So that is a difficult thing to project alongside the really enormous technical demands.
It will be apparent to the listeners that the difficulty in Alkan's music is of a very high virtuosic order, but there's also an element that you don't find too much in other music of that particular genre, and that is that there are certain athletic considerations, because one has, for such a piece, to conserve one's energies. Because there are several very huge climaxes in the first movement alone, and if one spends oneself right away, one will not have anything left for the rest. And I guess it's like tenors saving themselves for the high C, if you will. But there are several high Cs in this piece, and perhaps higher notes as well.
To play, it's an all-engulfing experience. One has to light a candle to one's favourite saint, and then walk on. You just throw yourself into it. You have to concentrate very hard. You have to be very much on top of it. You have to have considerable staying power. I know the feeling of emerging at the end in the first movement of that enormous development section. There's the most thrilling lead back into the recapitulation. One of the most thrilling pianistic and musical experiences, I think, from the 19th century.
I love playing this music, and especially this piece. It's like reciting a poem in a way. A poem that has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. You start at the beginning and you see the end. And in between, there's all this wonderful journey.
Marc-Andre Hamelin. And back here in Studio One,